David Spears. We're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight, and joining me on the panel, the Ukrainian ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Myroshnychenko, former High Commissioner to the UK, and former Attorney General George Brandis, academic and author Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who spent more than 2 years in an Iranian jail, Labor member for Wills, Peter Khalil, who sits on Parliament's Security and Intelligence Committee, and Professor of Strategic Studies at the ANU, Hugh White. Please make them all feel welcome.
Boris Johnson was elected just over 3 years ago with one of the highest mandates in recent history. He has recently resigned as a result of a number of scandals, including 50 of his MPs announcing their resignation. Can you give us some insight, scandals aside, as to how a man who only 3 years ago was so popular is now so heavily disliked?
I like the scandals aside there. George Brandis, let me start with you having recently returned as High Commissioner to the UK.
Well, I think the short answer is because he was reckless. He won a huge mandate in December of 2019, the biggest Tory majority since the days of Margaret Thatcher, and in the years since, he did exactly what he promised to do. That was, his election slogan was "Get Brexit Done." Well, he got Brexit done and delivered that, which was a very, very important event in British history and European history indeed. But like a lot of politicians who were capable of navigating the big things, he took his eye off the smaller things. So what brought him down were a number of incidents, particularly the way in which he was undisciplined, his staff was undisciplined during the pandemic. They didn't observe the rules that they were asking other people in the United Kingdom to observe. Standing alone, you might think they were trivial, but they took on a very symbolic importance too. And people thought, well, this is he may be an extremely talented man, as I think he is, but nevertheless, he didn't abide by the rules that he expected us to abide by. That was carelessness and it was recklessness. And this is the great paradox of Boris Johnson. He has, I think, a well-earned reputation for being a brilliant man, but also a very untidy and reckless man. And often it's the small things, those small acts of untidiness and recklessness, that bring down political leaders who are otherwise, in the big scheme of things, very gifted.
But can I just take issue with the description of this as reckless small things? Did he also contribute, do you think, to the debasing of politics and the breaking of trust with leadership when it came to these issues with the truth?
Up to a point, I think that's true, but you know, in every generation you hear that said about every generation of political leaders. I think the case of Boris Johnson was a particularly egregious case of that, I have to say, but it certainly wasn't unique. I mean, half a political generation ago, remember Tony Blair was widely condemned for lying about the Iraq War and the weapons of mass destruction.
It all adds up, though, doesn't it?
Of course it adds up. And but the point I'm trying to make, David, is on these very big history-changing moments, like Brexit, Boris Johnson was almost had the world at his feet as a political statesman. But when it came to the smaller things, or what appeared to him to be the smaller things that people nevertheless sit up and take notice of and care about, he let himself down.
I want to hear from everybody on this if we can. Ambassador, Ukraine held Boris Johnson in particular high regard.
Boris Johnson is a hero in Ukraine, and I'm totally aware about his domestic issues which he's had, but he visited Ukraine as a prime minister 3 times. Twice he came at the times when Russians invaded. He was the first one out there in April when Russian troops were actually in Kiev, on the outskirts of Kiev. So in Ukraine, he is really a national hero. Everybody is offering him a job now in Ukraine. There have been people actually promoting him to the job of a prime minister. Others offered him other jobs. And there is so much creativity now about Boris Johnson. You get all these paintings, songs, cupcakes dedicated to Boris Johnson. So he's really a superstar in Ukraine. Everybody loves him, and of course I was very disappointed to hear that he's not that popular among my British friends. But look, this is the world we live in, and I think he really demonstrated global leadership of actually standing up to this bullying behavior of Russia. He was out there, one of the first ones to make a very strong statement, and I think he will be remembered in history like that. And it's still not the end of the day. Maybe he'll come back one day as a prime minister. We don't know, right?
I wouldn't expect so. But
well, just quickly on that, because I want to hear from everybody. Who will be the prime minister?
Well, the Tory leadership contest is on at the moment.
You've probably got a few thoughts, I'm sure.
I think there are three who will emerge as the final three. Rishi Sunak, who resigned as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Penny Mordaunt, who was the International Development Secretary, and Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary. Now, the way it works, David, is they narrow it, that the MPs have a succession of exhaustive ballots, and they narrow it down to a choice of two. And then the last two have a plebiscite vote among the 160,000 Tory rank-and-file members in the country. It looks to me as if Rishi Sunak is bound to be in the final two. And the interesting question will be, which of the remaining five will be the other one? Now, I think of the remaining five, the two who may be, well, almost certainly will be the other in the final two, will either be Penny Mordaunt or Liz Truss.
Okay.
And the politics of the next few days, through these successive ballots, will be all about Liz Truss trying to overtake Penny Mordaunt to get into the final two.
Kylie, Moore-Gilbert, just back on Boris Johnson. It is a remarkable story of someone who was put in the job by his colleagues because of his popularity, but then this extraordinary fall from grace. What were your impressions of that?
So my impressions of Boris go back to when I was living in London and he was the mayor of London, and he always had this kind of air of messiness, perhaps to put it lightly, chaos, surrounding him. But at that point, I believe most people in London actually liked him and thought he was doing a good job. You know, the Boris bikes and all of these schemes that he initiated. I was in prison when Theresa May left office and Boris came in, but I did read about it in the Iranian newspapers, which obviously had a very different spin on things than you might imagine. But yeah, I mean, I think the problem with Boris is not his policies, but his character. And this, I guess, is the distinction from Tony Blair in a sense, that he was lying about personal misdemeanours and he was actually fined money because of committing a personal offence in office. His policies, as Ambassador Myroshnychenko mentioned, were not all that bad. I mean, especially his foreign policy and his support for Ukraine. He did deliver on Brexit and get that done as promised. It was these personal misdemeanours, and I think people are sick of politicians being corrupt, lying, promising things they have no intention on delivering on, and, you know, the British public's rage at Boris Johnson for these misdemeanours is testament to that.
My question for the panel is whether Australia is being complacent with the AUKUS arrangement, and what does this mean for the potential for China to invade Taiwan? Would America provide effective strategy to stop a potential conflict?
Hugh White, let me go to you first on this. You've just written a quarterly essay about some of these very issues.
Yes, thanks, David, and thanks for the question. Look, I think we are being complacent. I think we're being complacent about the risk of war between the US and China over Taiwan. I think it's higher than most other people do, and that's because I think it's harder to deter China from taking military action against Taiwan. And that's because I think it's harder for America to win a war over Taiwan. And is therefore more likely that the leaders in Beijing will calculate that it's worth their risk to have a go. Moreover, I don't think AUKUS is going to help us much on that. Primarily because, at the very best, the submarines that the core of the AUKUS deal won't be delivered in any numbers that are strategically significant until the 2050s. And that's 30 years from now. Now, the strategic contest between America and China, which is transforming Asia at the moment, is going to be over long before then. And so I think we're being complacent in thinking that that AUKUS helps us in addressing that broader strategic question. I think we're also being complacent in thinking that it deals with the challenge we have in replacing our present submarines.
Well, I think the government is talking more about the 2040s than the 2050s, but either way, I take your point on that. Isn't your contention more, though, that AUKUS itself and the Quad, all of these sort of alliances and relationships with some of our old friends is not necessarily the best way to go for Australia?
Just on the subs, the first submarine arrives in 2040, yes. But one submarine's not a capability. Correct. Any more than one chopstick is an eating implement. You know, you need 6.
No, I take your point.
Look, on the broader point, look, right at the heart of this, and the issue about Taiwan, the issues we're seeing in the South China Sea, there's something much bigger even than Taiwan underlying those, and this is which is going to be the primary power in East Asia for the remainder of this century. That's one of the biggest questions that Australia's ever faced. And my concern is that we've slipped into the feeling that Australia should be willing to go to war with China, to support America in going to war with China, in order to prevent it taking America's place as the primary power in East Asia. Now, I would much rather that China didn't take America's place, but I don't think going to war with China to stop it is going to work, because I don't think that's a war we can win.
Peter Khalil, is that what this is about? Is that what Australia's doing, preparing to go to war with China?
Well, David, first on AUKUS, I was very critical of the previous government because not only did they botch the relationship with France and President Macron, but they left us with a capability gap of 25 years. Now, you know, they made an assumption that the current Collins-class boat, which will be about 50 years old by 2040, could be retrofitted or refitted and somehow be the capability we need to protect our maritime environment. And my question is, what kind of regional superiority do we get out of a refitted 50-year-old submarine? Is it regional superiority over Easter Island? And they didn't have an answer for that. So Richard Marles, our Defence Minister, is now looking at all the options because he's right. The first boats, the subs, come out in the 2040s, the mid-2040s, but there's still 25 years until then. On Taiwan, I have great respect for Hugh, and he makes an elegant argument and analysis, but once it sort of leaves a test tube of the academic paper into the real world, it starts to break down because there's a couple of assumptions that Hugh makes that need to be really called out. And the first is the assumption that Xi Jinping will take this action of using a military force to invade Taiwan, when there is a real underestimation of the massive impact it will have not only on the global economy of such action, but on China's economy. It would be catastrophic. And they also have elements within the Chinese Communist Party who would resist such an action. All the gains that China's made economically and with regard to its prosperity over decades would be put at risk. And secondly, even if he does roll the dice and takes that action, we have seen that the same commentators and analysts who are saying that Ukraine would collapse within 72 hours in the face of the might of the giant Russian military have been proven wrong. And those same analysts have been saying the same about Taiwan, that they would fall relatively quickly. Whereas Taiwan is an island of 25 million people, the size of Netherlands. It's armed to the teeth. It is defending itself, and it is very unlikely, in my view, that it would fall relatively quickly.
Okay. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, what's your thoughts on that? And back to Vishan's question, which is about AUKUS and you know, whether, I guess, that is a good arrangement for Australia to be part of, and whether it's an effective vehicle or strategy to stop conflict in Taiwan.
I mean, I don't really know that much about submarines per se, but on the subject of Taiwan, I read Hugh's essay and I thought it was really instructive and really interesting. But I do believe you said perhaps that we should come out and be clear to Taiwan that we're not prepared to go to war militarily to defend them. And I actually, you know, I was struck by that, looking at Ukraine and looking at the fact that it was very clear before Russia invaded Ukraine that the US and NATO would not intervene militarily and support the Ukrainians, and whether or not that had an impact on triggering the Russian attack to begin with. Considering Taiwan, I think retaining a measure of strategic ambiguity is probably useful. If the Chinese don't know if NATO or the US or even Australia or anybody would actually step up and help Taiwan in the event of an invasion, perhaps that might restrain them and you know, act as a brake on any you know, plans that they might have in that space. Well,
Ambassador Myroshnychenko, let me ask you, what are the lessons from what's happening in your country, in Ukraine, for this situation in Taiwan?
Look, many people make a comparison, but I think they cannot be compared, Ukraine and Taiwan, for one reason. Australia, as well as most of other countries, recognize one China policy.
That's right.
So Ukraine is a sovereign nation. We're independent. We've been actually a founding member of the United Nations, and we've been now invaded by Russia. Taiwan is a different case, but I think you should look actually at the political economy, because the biggest importer of Chinese products is America. China is the biggest investor in its treasury bonds. So the interdependence between China and America is at such a high level that it would be destructive for them to go at war, actually. Now, what's the role of China in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And as you have been observing, the No Limits partnership, which was announced at the beginning of the Olympic Games in Beijing, this is very interesting to see, because we understand that a lot will depend on China. And actually, in the case of Russians coming into Kazakhstan earlier this year, if you noted, all Russian troops left Kazakhstan after the call of Xi to Vladimir Putin. So we understand that China can really play a role, and China is not benefiting from this war. They're benefiting geopolitically, but at the same of the day, they have the largest population, the prices for commodities have surged, and China is the biggest importer of commodities in the world. So I think it's important for China to understand that it's not in their interest to prop up Russia too much. And because Russia does not depend on the West as much as China depends on the West. So I think this is very clear, and I want China to understand it, and I hope they do.
While we see so many people in Australia affected by the recent flood disaster, we see our Prime Minister Albanese running around to Ukraine, offering lots of money and other assistance for war, while leaving our Australian people without much of a help. Why is that?
Well, Peter, before we hear from you, let me just hear Kylie. I want to bring you into this conversation. There's been a range of those criticising Anthony Albanese for his overseas travel in the short time that he's been PM. What do you think?
I think the floods in New South Wales were devastating. I have family who live in Western Sydney and who were affected by that. I think it's great that he visited Ukraine and Kyiv and showed his support for the war effort there. Perhaps he could have come back a tiny bit more quickly, but it's really, really hard. Obviously, they have a lot of international objectives that they want to get under their belts in the first few months of post-election, and juggling that with domestic needs is, a challenge.
Peter?
Could I just say thanks for the question, Naeem. I've heard these criticisms of the Prime Minister. Let's be really clear. Anthony Albanese was on the ground, the Prime Minister, with the New South Wales Premier, providing immediate relief when he got back from his trip. He was straight there where the floods were happening. And I've heard this criticism from the Liberal Party, the new opposition, where they've tried to make this nonsensical comparison between him and Scott Morrison, who went on holiday in Hawaii when there were bushfires. Let's be clear. Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister, was not sitting on a beach drinking pina coladas while there were bushfires. He was going into a war zone to support a country that was invaded brutally, illegally and immorally by its large power neighbour, major power neighbour, to provide that support with all the other democracies and other countries of the international community. Why? Because it has a meaning for us here in this region. As I said earlier, we don't want to live in a world where might is just right. And just on the point about the PM's travel, which trips does the opposition and the critics of the PM say that he shouldn't have done? The one with President Widodo, our important Indonesian neighbour, the one with President Macron to repair the relationship that was destroyed in the previous government, the one where he actually visited Ukraine. I want to know which one was the one that he shouldn't have gone.
Question for George Brandis. My brother Julian Assange has spent the last 3 years in a UK maximum security prison, fighting extradition to the US, where he faces a potential prison sentence of 175 years. Recently, he suffered a mini-stroke, the prison conditions and legal process taking its toll on his mind and body. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has said enough is enough, but Julian remains in jail. A recent SMH poll showed that 71% of Australians agreed with the statement that Julian should be brought home. All the major press freedom and human rights organisations have called on the Biden administration to drop the charges against Julian. As a former UK High Commissioner and former Attorney General, how would you go about carrying out the wishes of the Australian people and the Prime Minister and ending Julian's imprisonment?
George Brandis.
Well, it's not up to us to end Julian Assange's imprisonment because he is being the subject of a prosecution by the United States for a breach of American law. And the proceedings in London at the moment are extradition proceedings between the United States and Julian Assange. Australia is not a party to those proceedings. Australia wouldn't have the legal standing to be a party to those proceedings, nor should we be interfering with judicial proceedings. To do that would be to interfere with the course of justice.
But it was a decision of the Home Secretary in the UK to approve the extradition. Did you, as High Commissioner, make any representation?
I did not. I did not.
It's
the Australian government. It certainly was the Australian government's view that the legal proceedings and the extradition proceedings should run their course, and at no point did we seek to interfere with that process. Now, what we did do, though, is we gave Julian Assange exactly the same treatment and support that any Australian citizen in the UK would receive, the same consular support. In fact, I instructed the consular people at the Australian High Commission to make sure that every month we wrote to Julian Assange to ask him if there was anything he needed by way of assistance and support in a consular sense. And at no time did he say that he wasn't receiving the consular support he needed. But,
well,
of course, what he did say was that he wanted the Australian government to interfere with the process in the UK court between him and the United States.
Or the decision of the politician, the Home Secretary, Kylie, Moore-Gilbert. I mean, how much sympathy do you have for Julian Assange's situation?
I, of course, have sympathy for Julian Assange's situation. And, I mean, I think I disagree with a few points that George Brandis just made. The first being this isn't a regular consular case. This isn't an Aussie in Bali who's had too much to drink and fallen off their scooter or something, you know. This is a political case. It's inherently political. And Julian Assange, like him or loathe him, is a political prisoner.
Well, I don't agree with that. I do not agree with that, and I don't have any personal feeling one way or another about Julian Assange. He's been charged with
espionage by the United States.
Yeah, which is a very serious crime.
Sure, but WikiLeaks is many things. Do you believe it's an espionage outfit?
I think that's a decision for a United States court to make.
Did Julian Assange commit a crime on US soil? Do they have universal jurisdiction over Julian Assange?
That is a decision for a United States court to make. But
the definition of espionage is on behalf of a foreign country or a foreign body. Is WikiLeaks, do they fit that definition or do they more fit the definition of a publisher?
That very argument was put before the British judge, before whom the extradition proceedings was brought and dismissed.
So you don't think that he deserves any intervention whatsoever by us, being his country of citizenship?
I believe that
as a political prisoner?
I don't believe he's a political prisoner. I believe Julian Assange is entitled to exactly the same treatment as any Australian in trouble ought to receive from the Australian government by way of consular assistance. And I think we ought to respect the integrity of both the judicial processes of the United Kingdom and the integrity of the United States criminal justice system.
Peter, let me just bring in Peter here, because, Peter, I'm keen for your perspective on this. Pre-politics, you were in Iraq for quite some time as a security advisor during the Iraq War to the provisional government there. What did you make of this sort of, you know, the WikiLeaks classified information being released? And how have you now come to the view, as you have over the last year or so, that you actually think these espionage charges should be dropped?
Yeah, well, to be clear, David, I'm a member of the Parliamentary Friends to bring Julian Assange home. It's a cross-party membership, all major parties, Independents, Labor, Liberal, Greens and so on. And we've made representations to the President, the US President, to drop the charges and the DOJ to drop the charges. So let's be clear, and I want to be open about this. I've been in quite a bit of touch with Gabriel, Julian's brother, around the legal case that he's going through, that George sort of stepped out. So there is the legal case, there is the appeal process that are ongoing there. But there's also the other element of this. And Prime Minister Albanese has said that, you know, this case has gone on long enough and it needs to be brought to a close. There is quiet diplomacy, and when he was asked a question, he said not all diplomacy is done with a loud hailer. There is something to be said for quiet diplomacy. The the points that you ask about with respect to whether Julian Assange or not, you can argue the merits of whether he is, investigative journalist and whether the dump of material which wasn't redacted, like the Pentagon Papers and others, was good journalism or not. The point, there's a matter of principle here at stake, and liberal democracies like ours have to match our rhetoric on the freedom of the press with real action and backing that up. And for me, that is a fundamental principle, given that we've just been talking about the rise of authoritarian regimes around the world and their threat to press freedom and to journalists doing their work. But I want to say too that there are many other Australians who are arbitrarily detained overseas, and we need to pay attention to their cases, whether it's Cheng Li, Dr. Yang in China, which the Foreign Minister Wong has raised with her counterpart in their recent meeting, which was the first, by the way, in 3 years, whether it's Sean Turnell in Myanmar, whether it's Robert Pether, who is in a prison in Iraq, and I've been doing some work around that. So these are important matters, and we need to do everything we can to help those Australians be released, like what happened with Kylie.
Well, let me ask you, Kylie, because you've just written a powerful book about your own experience imprisoned in Iran. And we're just talking about Julian Assange, and we know that his physical and mental well-being is absolutely suffering as a result of what's going on there. You were, 804 days in prison. How on earth did you cope with that?
I mean, the book is about that subject, essentially. You don't cope. I mean, this is one of my primary concerns about Julian Assange, is the prison conditions that he is being kept in Belmarsh prison in the UK. This isn't Iran. This isn't Iraq, where poor Robert Pether is currently rotting away under fears right now of suffering from cancer. This is the United Kingdom. Why does he have to be kept in a maximum security prison, largely in solitary confinement? He did suffer a mini stroke, as Gabrielle mentioned. I don't understand why somebody who's clearly not at risk of committing violence or endangering the UK public at all should be kept alongside criminals, murderers, terrorists in a maximum security prison. There's that, and I mean the initial court ruling in the UK was very much about that, about the impact on his mental and physical health, given those prison conditions and the limbo that he's been subjected to. An uncertain, unclear amount of time in prison with no end date. That is a form of psychological torture.
But the reason that there is not a finite end date is because there is a process underway, and he, as he's entitled to do, is appealing each decision until the appeal process exhausts itself. And in the meantime, because he's a flight risk,
why would he be a flight risk from a low security prison?
He is a
low security prison. How is he a flight risk?
There has never been a complaint that I'm aware of that the nature of the prison has contributed to his mental or physical well-being.
I can tell you 100% it would have.
Well,
you are locked in a cell 23 to 24 hours a day on your own. You don't think, for days and days, he's been there for 3 years, you don't think that's going to have an impact on his mental health?
He hasn't been in solitary confinement for 3 years.
For a large period of time he has, and he's been diagnosed with a number of mental health illnesses as a result directly of the prison conditions.
Which is why I insisted that we constantly inquire to ensure that his mental and physical health...
Why didn't you request he be removed to a prison that is less harsh, where he's not being kept in the conditions that terrorists are being subjected to?
Australia respects the criminal justice system of the United Kingdom. We do.
You can make requests diplomatically. When I was in prison in Iran, the Australian embassy made repeated requests that I be removed out of a high security solitary confinement ward to a kinder, more open, more free ward. That is entirely possible in your remit as a diplomat.
But surely you're not making a comparison between the UK prison system and the Iranian prison system.
Well, George Brandis, that is a very valid question, though.
Diplomat.
Why is it okay to make that request in one jurisdiction and not another?
Because we were satisfied that the way in which the UK prison system was treating Mr Assange was appropriate in the circumstances. By asking him to articulate any complaints that he had to us so that, if appropriate, we could make an intervention.
But in court, he in court said that he is a suicide risk. And the initial court in the UK ruled on mental health grounds due to fears about his treatment in prison in the United States should he be extradited there.
But that's not the United Kingdom.
Yeah, but it's a current mental health assessment given his current conditions in Belmarsh prison.
Not to complicate matters, I'm sorry, but you're discussing the UK legal process and the prison system and so on. The Obama administration actually dropped charges against Chelsea Manning and provided clemency. The Trump administration doubled down on Julian Assange, right? So we are hoping that the Biden administration would look at his case in the same way as they looked at Chelsea Manning. But we haven't even got to the US system yet. So I just want to make
Peter,
that
and if President Biden decides, or the Attorney General of the United States decides to drop the charges, that will be a matter for the United States. But
we can ask them to,
but Australia,
diplomatically.
Australia respects the integrity of the United States criminal justice system, and we respect the integrity of the United Kingdom criminal justice system.
We do need to move on. We cannot ask them.
Well, that is all we have time for tonight. Thanks to our panel, Vasyl, Myroshnychenko, George Brandis, Kylie Moore-Gilbert, Peter Khalil and Hugh White. And thank you for your questions and for sharing your stories with us. And to you at home, thanks for joining the conversation too. Now, Q&A is taking a short break, returning for a Monday night special on August the 1st at 9:35 p.m. Stan Grant will be taking the show to the Northern Territory, broadcasting from the Garma Festival, Australia's largest Indigenous cultural gathering. We'll hear from local and national leaders and discuss the Albanese government's commitment to a First Nations voice to Parliament. And you can join me Sunday morning for Insiders. Until then, good night.